How would you feel if you checked into an Airbnb and found a hidden camera? Ian was shocked and horrified to find this webcam nestled between the cushions on a sofa in the living room of his Airbnb. This is a breach of your right to privacy, no? But what about if they declared it in the terms and conditions? What if they made you accept those terms and conditions? Let's find out. Now, you might draw the reasonable conclusion that Airbnb hosts, or any hotel for that matter, does not have the right to put a camera in your room, your hotel, or your Airbnb suite. However, this is where it gets very slightly complicated. There is more than one page on the Airbnb website that discusses the use of cameras and recording devices during your stay. The first, it appears, is a public-facing, consumer-oriented page in the About Airbnb breadcrumb section. Airbnb, our community policies, privacy, use of cameras and recording devices. But here is where there's a little bit of a disparity, in my view, between these terms and the terms that are directed at Airbnb hosts. But we'll come to those in just a moment. The first bit here, it says, what we do allow. They do allow, let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see that a little bit more clearly. What we do allow are disclosed devices monitoring only public spaces and common areas. Devices that allow for viewing and monitoring of only a public space like the front door, the driveway, or a common space that's clearly identified and disclosed ahead of a reservation are permitted. Common spaces do not include sleeping areas or bathrooms. I should hope not. What we don't allow, these consumer-facing terms go on to say, concealed and undisclosed devices monitoring common spaces. I should certainly think not. Anything that is concealed by the very nature of the word suggests something nefarious. Or for that matter, an undisclosed device. Any device monitoring a common space should be installed in a visible manner and disclosed in the listing description, which is what we'll come back to in a moment. Devices located in or monitoring private spaces. Devices should never monitor private spaces, for example, bedrooms, bathrooms, or common areas that are being used as sleeping areas, such as living room with a sofa bed. Now, this is one area, of course, where it contradicts potentially what Ian Timbrell found nestled between the sofa cushions during his stay at the Airbnb. It says here, areas that are being used as a sleeping area, such as a living room with a sofa bed. But what if it doesn't have a sofa bed? What if, like my son, you like to sleep on a blow-up bed, camping style, in the living room or wherever? Then that might then mean that the living room becomes the bedroom. He finds that fun. Many people might find that fun. So surely that then turns it into a sleeping area. But what if there is a disclosed camera in the listing, in the living room area, that you then want to use as a sleeping area? We'll come back to that towards the end of the video and what you might want to do about it. But then we move to the terms that are directed at Airbnb hosts. Following the breadcrumbs here for context, all topics, managing your listing. So this is directed at Airbnb hosts, listing details, amenities, guest resources, informing guests about security devices. Now, for the host's information, informing guests about security devices. There's a balance between keeping your place safe and secure and your guests' privacy. Intentionally concealed recording devices such as hidden security cameras are never permitted. Airbnb prohibits security cameras or recording devices that are in or observe private spaces like bedrooms, bathrooms, or sleeping areas. Sleeping areas not being well defined here. You must indicate the presence of all security cameras or other recording devices in or around a listing, even if they're not turned on or hooked up. Undisclosed security cameras or other recording devices are never permitted. You must always disclose if an active recording is taking place. In order to disclose a recording device in the listing, the host needs to go to Listings, click on the listing, under the space, scroll down, Guest Safety Info, Security Cameras or Audio Recording Devices, describe each device, its location, and if it will be turned off or on. You'll also be asked to confirm the details in the listing. But then this surely, when the person is booking the Airbnb, will be notified that these cameras are in use and potentially, I don't know because I've never seen the thing pop up, but potentially asked to confirm that they agree to the recording device being used. What if you have agreed to that recording device being used? Well, that is when we come to a balance between what you can consent to within the terms of a contract as against your right to privacy. Now, these cases, to my knowledge, certainly within the English and Welsh courts, have not yet been before the courts to determine the extent of the right to privacy in an Airbnb. But I can tell you from my knowledge, my experience, my expertise, and from some cases that have gone to court, this would be a very precarious situation indeed for anybody running an Airbnb. Data protection legislation requires that any recording and any processing, any storing and sharing must only be that which is absolutely necessary and reasonable in the circumstances. Is it necessary and reasonable for an Airbnb host to be monitoring, recording, storing, whatever, the living space of an Airbnb? Potentially. However, only if it has been agreed to in advance and it is necessary and reasonable in the circumstances, the onus of which will be upon the Airbnb host to demonstrate and prove in court if there were a claim against them. But worse still are situations where the cameras are not just undisclosed, but completely invisible to the naked eye, such as this one here, which is disclosed in a router which is in the Airbnb, which is monitoring the room without anybody's awareness. Now, there are devices such as this one on screen that you can buy from Amazon, link in the description below, which will scan the room for bugs and recording devices and hidden devices that you might just want to buy to check any hotel room or Airbnb that you're staying in, just to ensure that you're not being filmed and recorded. Now, if this router is so dodgy that it's got a hidden camera in it that's spying on you whilst you're in your bedroom, imagine the data that it's collecting on you if you connect to it whilst you're in your Airbnb. Well, apart from being spied on, many people have their entire lives turned upside down because they have their identity stolen because they connect to these sort of devices. And the root of this problem is that too many people are simply unaware of how much of their data is being leaked online all of the time. They are unaware of how to protect their data and how to secure their devices. And I'm going to prove it to you. Do this whether you're on a mobile phone or on a computer. So if you're on a phone, do it on a computer if you've got one handy, or open a new window. Or if you're on a laptop, open a new window so you can hear this video in the background. And I'd like you to go to the following web address, which is from my partner for this video. Go to nordvpn.com/BlackBeltBarrister. And you're going to see, if you're not connected to a service like this, you're going to see a screen a little something like this. This is going to tell you what your IP address is, what your ISP is, the company with whom you purchase your internet services, and where you are located. Obviously, I've blurred these details out and I've turned off the service so that I can demonstrate this to you. And it will tell you where you are, what service you are with, and what your IP address is. This is just by going to the web address. But imagine how much information is gathered together in the internet cookies, the data cookies, and any other devices that are on the network that you are on. So thinking of this along the lines of the story that we've been talking about in this video, being in an Airbnb, or in a cafe, or a hotel, or any other public Wi-Fi. There could be other devices on that network that you are not sure of, that are unsecure, and they employ all sorts of different tactics to attack your computer. There are various different strategies that they use. One's called a man-in-the-middle attack, where you think your computer is sending data to another website or provider, but there's a device on the network that sits in the middle of that exchange of data and steals the information. Likewise, there might be what we call malware, which is bad software that essentially does the same thing. You think you're downloading and using good software, when in fact it might be spying on your computer in the background. Likewise, malvertising, which is bad advertising, which you might think is just an advert. You might click on the advert and you might think it's just an advert. You might see, this is after all how advertising works. People might see these and think, yes, I would like that. I saw something this morning that I think a friend of mine would like. So I clicked the advert and went through it. And immediately in my mind, I thought of the video that I'm going to do for you with my partner for this video today. Because this service will protect you from malvertising, malware, man-in-the-middle attacks, password attacks, and all sorts of other things. Even QR scams, where you see these little QR codes on devices or boxes and you scan them because it brings up some information. Even those can be malicious. Now, there was an interesting study done called the National Privacy Test in conjunction with my partner for this video, NordVPN. Over 26,000 people took part in this test. and the results were relatively shocking. They revealed that only 3% answered the questions correctly as to what tools are necessary to protect your privacy online. Only 11% knew what data their internet service provider would collect as part of the collective metadata that these services collect on you. For example, you will have seen, if you're not protected already, the service provider that you use when you went to that web address just now. If you didn't, do it now, and it will show you the internet service provider you use. Only 15% of the participants knew how to secure their home Wi-Fi network, and only roughly a third knew the importance of the online terms with apps and how to identify a malicious phishing website. So as you will have noticed, there is a link on screen, which if you go to, you'll get a discount and 4 extra months because you use my discount for being partnered with NordVPN on this channel. It is a service I use it on all of my devices, my MacBook, my iPad, my iPhone, so that I know that my devices and my data is secure when I'm traveling around. So hopefully that is useful to you. Please do sign up at that link in the description below. It does support my partner who supports me on this channel to bring you thousands of videos on free legal guidance. And now let's move on to what you will do if you are in this position where you have discovered something like a camera that is spying on you in a place that you visit. So there's 2 possible scenarios here. One, the more nefarious kind, where you discover a hidden recording device which you didn't consent to, you weren't alerted to, and that it appears to be recording you without your knowledge, without your consent. This, I would hope, is the more straightforward. This is completely illegal. This is not just an invasion of your privacy, but there will also be criminal elements attached to it as well. Just a few short years ago, an Airbnb superhost was arrested, charged, and thrown in prison when one of the guests found this hidden camera concealed inside the router, spying on them in their bedroom. But what about the slightly more complicated scenario number 2, where you've either been told that there's a recording device inside the Airbnb or hotel room, or worse still, that you've been made to agree in the terms and conditions of staying that this device is going to be used and recording you? Well, there's 2 bits of law that come into play here. First of all, from the perspective of the United Kingdom, we have the Consumer Rights Act of 2015. There'll be a similar provision in other jurisdictions, no doubt. But under this piece of legislation, if a term is deemed to be unfair, then it's unenforceable. So, in other words, it doesn't really matter whether you agree to that term at all. If it's found to be unfair, then it will be unenforceable. Simply speaking, if a term is found to be unfair in a consumer contract, it is not binding on the consumer. And this applies to unfair customer notices as well. For example, if a shop said no returns under any circumstances, that is obviously not fair. So, whilst it might be argued, well, we warned you about it, it's not legally binding. So you can just go ahead and buy the thing and this notice is not binding on you. But likewise, a term that you might have agreed to. But what is an unfair term? A term that is unfair if, contrary to the requirement of good faith, it causes a significant imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations under the contract to the detriment of the consumer. Now, having a camera recording you is to your detriment, and it is almost certainly going to be found to be an imbalance in the rights of the parties if this case goes to court. Because the Airbnb host is not being recorded by this camera. Yes, they have the right to make sure that the place is safe, but the court, in my view, is likely to say, well, you can do that by other means. They could take photographs of the place beforehand, photographs afterwards, and then demonstrate any damage caused by the consumer in between, and then bill them or sue them for that damage, as against filming them whilst they're staying there and they have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Even, I would argue, in the living spaces. But let's say that that argument fails and the court decided that it's not an unfair term for an Airbnb host to require you to agree to the presence of a recording device whilst you stay at their Airbnb. Well, in that case, the alternative argument, because these things are often argued in the alternative, phrased as such, further or alternatively in the particulars of claim, which we'll come back to in a moment, there's also the data protection legislation. Now, in the UK, there'll be similar provisions elsewhere, no doubt. But in the UK, we have the retained UK GDPR, which still incorporates Article 7 GDPR, which is the conditions for consent. And under Article 7, the data subject shall have the right to withdraw his or her consent at any time. It shall be as easy to withdraw as to give consent. But it's even a little bit stricter than that, because consent given to process your data, which filming you will certainly be your consent because you'll be personally identifiable from the video footage, which makes it personal data, that consent must be freely given. The ICO here has guidance for organizations on what freely given consent really means. And it describes here that if an individual has no real choice, then consent is not freely given and it will be invalid. So in other words, if you had no choice but to give your consent to be filmed just to stay in one of these Airbnbs or a hotel room, then that consent is not really by real choice, and therefore it's not really freely given, and therefore it's invalid. But also, freely given consent means that people must be able to refuse consent without detriment and must be able to withdraw consent easily at any time. It also means consent should be unbundled from other terms and conditions, including giving separate granular consent options to different types of processing wherever possible. Because, of course, Airbnb is going to process some of your data to process your booking, just as any other hotel would. However, this particular consent for this particular type of data, i.e. being filmed at any place within the building, must be freely given, and you have the right to withdraw it. And recital 43 of GDPR makes it even clearer that consent is presumed not to be freely given if the performance of the contract, including the provision of a service, such as Airbnb or hotel rooms, is dependent on the consent, despite such consent not being necessary for such performance. Now, consent to being filmed is not, in my view, necessary to perform the contract of booking an Airbnb. And the ICO goes on to give a very useful example, remembering that this is aimed at organizations. An online furniture store requires customers to consent to their details being shared with other homeware stores as part of their checkout process. The store is making consent a condition of sale, but sharing the data with other stores is not necessary for that sale, so consent is not freely given and is not valid. The store should ask customers to consent to passing their data to named third parties, but it must allow them a free choice to opt in or out. And of course, going back to the previous point, people can withdraw consent without detriment under the legislation. So this is essentially what the law says. There are two arguments, one being whether it's in breach of data protection legislation in the first place, in that it is quite possibly more than is necessary, reasonable and proportionate in the first place. But even if that argument fails, you can withdraw that consent anyway, because that's what GDPR provides. But what if you end up in this situation? You either find a hidden camera or you've consented to these terms. You now realize that you have the right to withdraw that consent, and for one of any number of reasons, you might wish to make a claim against them. Well, for most of these cases, the damages are likely to be under £10,000, and all of which would have to start with a letter of claim, which you'll find in one of these videos here to help guide you through that process, as guidance, of course, not legal advice. But for now, thank you for watching.